Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Unlocking Multimodality in North America, Using Bikes to Better Our Transit Systems. Thanks for joining us today. During this hour-long conversation, you'll hear from transit experts across North America, as they discuss how bikes can increase public transit ridership and decrease car dependency. They'll provide both a broad overview of the issues and real-world examples. Today's webinar is hosted by Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to its complex problems. Island Press elevates voices of change, shines a spotlight on crucial issues, and focuses attention on sustainable solutions, just like we're doing with this free webinar presentation today. We've got a great panel to give our webinar presentation. They include Chris and Melissa Bruntlett, the authors of Building the Cycling City, and the owners and operators of Modacity. We've got Kat Maines, a planner at Alta Planning and Design, and we have Michelle Poyourow, a senior associate at Jarrett Walker and Associates. Corinne Kisner is the Deputy Director of NACDO, and she's going to be moderating the conversation today. During the conversation, we welcome your questions, and I encourage you to put them into the questions panel on the sidebar of the webinar screen. We will ask them at the end of the presentations. So before we begin, let me tell you a little bit more about our panelists. Melissa and Chris Bruntlett are the co-founders of Modacity, a creative agency using words, photography, and film to inspire happier, healthier, simpler forms of mobility. Together, they work with a variety of organizations, including municipal governments, transportation agencies, nonprofits, and corporate clients, to address the evolving needs of cities large and small and enable a variety of mobility options as a way to create successful and more livable regions. Their new book, Building the Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, is now available from Island Press. We have Kat Maines, is a lead GA planner with Alta Planning and Design. Her mission is to retrofit city transportation systems to make it easier, safer, and more fun to choose walkability, walking, biking, and transit. She specializes in finding the most robust design solutions available within the implementation framework. She has experience working on concept designs that fill the gaps between the intent of planning and the realities of design. Kat has worked on trail projects across the country. Her focus is on Georgia and the Southeast, from large urban areas like Atlanta to small towns like Albany, Georgia. Her mission is to leverage the immense impact of mobility and transportation to create healthier and more sustainable communities. Kat completed her master's in city and regional planning at Georgia Tech and bachelor's of arts in architecture at Smith College. Michelle Poyourow entered the transportation field in Portland, Oregon in the US as a bike planner and public involvement specialist. She is now an expert in transit network design and policy. Her wide range of experience in transportation make her particularly valuable at a time when cities and transit agencies are balancing demands for multiple modes of limited funding and road space. Before working in the transportation field, Michelle worked as an aide to local elected officials. As a result of this work, she is sensitive to the political and social forces that affect the success of transit plans. Corinne Kisner will moderate our discussion today. Corinne is an urban planner dedicated to building safe, sustainable transportation systems in equitable, active cities through better street design and transportation policy. As the Deputy Director of NACDO, Corinne oversees the organization's national programs and publications and liaises with a network of 75 leading cities and transportation agencies to advance people-oriented urban design. And with those introductions, I will be handing over the presentation to Chris and Melissa to get started. There you go.
Hello, everybody. We're pretty excited to be a part of this webinar today and to have the opportunity to talk about one of our chapters from our book, which focuses largely on the topic we're talking about today, using bikes to help better our transportation systems. So the reason that we tried to focus on this in the book was because right now about 1.2 million train trips are taken in the Netherlands every day. And 50% of those, so about 600,000, start with a bicycle ride. So we see the immense potential there in terms of combining these two modes. It's really a remarkable, seamless, door-to-door system. It really draws the envy of transportation planners outside of the Netherlands, and many of whom are clamoring to find ways to get their residents to choose other more efficient modes over the single-occupant vehicle.
So what we have to do this morning is start out with an acknowledgement that the bicycle in and of itself is not a replacement for the private automobile. It lacks the required range, as people will only cycle journeys up to 8 kilometers in length. That's about 5 miles. And similarly, public transportation in and of itself won't substitute for the car, as it lacks the necessary penetration into lower density areas of our cities. But if we combine these two modes of transportation into a single bike transit system, we can create a seamless door-to-door mobility option, unlocking and making it capable of replacing countless car trips and reducing congestion in our cities.
So on this slide, we the point is to really note the increased efficiency when we're starting to think about bikes feeding public transportation. The typical person who's usually willing to walk about 1 kilometer on foot or 0.62 miles will, once you add a bike into that, be willing to travel about 5 times the distance, so 5 kilometers or up to 8, about that. And with the average speed about 15 kilometers an hour when you're using a bike, it really helps to expand the catchment area for our public transportation systems. So we're extrapolating those longer distances in every direction around a station, and suddenly these efficiencies really increase exponentially, allowing for larger station area, service areas, and fewer stops in the system. And our catchment area for our public transportation areas becomes 25 times the size than it does when we're talking about people walking to transit, increasing it from about 3 square kilometers or 1 square mile to over 79 square kilometers or 31 square miles in size.
The reason that this is important is because it provides people with options and therefore creates this alternative to the car. So rather than place the stations further apart, as was initially discussed in the Netherlands, they actually keep them the same distance together, giving people multiple choices in their neighborhood depending on their trip and final destination. So this provides people with the frequencies, freedom, and flexibility of the car without the stress of driving, parking, and the other inherent costs of taking the automobile to where they're going. And ultimately, this delivers more customers to the public transportation system and more cyclists to the bikeway, creating a virtuous circle of sustainable transportation.
So when we talk about the concept of bikes and transit, many advocates and planners usually aim for a way to make it convenient and easy by bringing bikes onto transit, whether that's buses or trains, so customers have the option of a last mile solution when they arrive. But we really need to be careful with this model because it's not necessarily efficient, scalable, or economical, as you can see with the images on the screen. Take, for example, in Vancouver, we have the bike racks on the front of our bus, but once you have more than 2 people with a bike, the system fails. So if the goal is really to increase the number of people that are cycling, and as those numbers rise, you can see the solution becomes unscalable, and so because there's not that finite amount of space for everyone who takes bikes to transit, and a system already running at capacity in many cities at peak times. And so we need to find a more sustainable and realistic option.
So in the Netherlands, they recognized this need for scalability well before the residents grew accustomed to taking their bikes on the trains by providing safe and secure bicycle parking at almost all of their train stations. These facilities have what helped the country reach that 50% mode share that Melissa referenced in the first slide, as travelers readily park their bikes in plentiful lots, knowing they'll be there for their return trip. And the biggest perk is that they're completely free. Outdoor facilities allow for unlimited time storage of the bike, and indoor, they're usually free for the first 24 hours. And that really, it comes down to scalability. So In Utrecht, they've increased their facilities around Utrecht Central Station to offer parking for 12,500 bikes. That's the facility you see on your screen, with room to grow as the demand increases without impacting the comfort of the train travelers.
And going back to that idea of the last mile solution, further helping that connection is their national bike share scheme in the Netherlands called OviFiets. It's available at any train station throughout the country, and the bikes really help to solve that last mile journey. So travelers who arrive at a station on their own bike, leave it in one of the adjacent parkades, hop on the train, and there's an OviFiets waiting for them at the other side of their train journey for just €3.50 per day. And it conveniently takes them from the train station to their final destination, then back again, circling back to that virtuous cycle Chris was referring to earlier. And that power, when we're talking about a North American context, comes when we're talking about combining docked and dockless bike share with transit. And there's really an incredible opportunity on this side of the Atlantic for that last mile journey.
So it should go without saying that a lot of these considerations are pointless without high quality, connected, comfortable bike infrastructure that leads directly to each transit stop. These transit stops can't be located on a proverbial island surrounded by busy streets and unpleasant cycling conditions. And we've actually seen that in some cities. Train and transport companies are implementing new bicycle parking facilities, but don't talk to local stakeholders or authorities and don't have the proper infrastructure required to actually reach these stations. So for the Dutch, it requires taking the Crow design principles of cohesion, directness, safety, attractiveness, and comfort, and continuing to apply them through the front door of the train station and right onto the platform if need be.
So in our book, when we were looking at how this concept is being applied outside of the Netherlands, one of the examples that we were able to research was the BTB study, which was facilitated by Clotilde Imbert of Copenhagen Heis, where 5 European cities have now tested this Dutch model and finding that the results were very much the same as what the Dutch had been experiencing for a number of years. So by improving infrastructure, providing those bike parking facilities at transit stations, as well as providing those last mile solutions through bike share of some kind, more and more residents in the cities that they studied are starting to choose to travel by a combination of bikes and transit as opposed to making the same trip by car. And so really it's for a modest investment, they started to see significant growth in the number of people both cycling and using transit, and in a solution that can be scaled up as those numbers inherently increase over time. So really the bottom line is that they're seeing fewer cars, more cyclists, and more train passengers. And so it's an impressive return when we're talking about a relatively small investment in bike parking and bike rentals.
So in a North American context, these models perhaps could be applied more suitably applied to areas of lower density and where people are traveling longer distances as they perhaps are in Europe. By providing these facilities at major bus and rail hubs in more suburban areas, residents suddenly have a viable alternative to driving their car. This not only reduces congestion, but also increases transit ridership and subsequent revenues from an increased number of transit trips, freeing up existing road space to allow for safe bicycle infrastructure and increasing the distances people feel comfortable traveling by bike. And this example is provided from the city of Atlanta, and we believe Kat, our colleague, will be talking a little bit about the experiences at Atlanta in the next presentation.
So that sort of summarizes where we wanted to start the conversation today. Thanks again for letting us provide some context for what we were finding in our research. And if you'd like to learn more about the Dutch model and its possibilities in North America, our book again is Building the Cycling City. It's available now. On the screen you can see a promo code if you order through Island Press. We're happy to send the business their way because they've been very supportive of us. And if you have any questions or concerns that we don't get a chance to answer through the chat today, feel free to contact us both by either email or website, which is modacitylife.com. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you both. All right, let's switch it over to Kat. And I'm giving you the screen now, Kat. Let me know when you get it. Oh, looking good. I see your screen. Oh, hello. There it is.
We good? Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you to Island Press for convening this webinar. I'm excited to share the topic with you all. And Thank you to everyone who's attended today to join the conversation. My name's Kat Means, as Jen introduced me, and I'm going to share some examples from some recent Atlanta planning work that takes some inspiration directly from the topics that Melissa and Chris just shared with you all. So, what's the problem? The most recent study of transit users in Atlanta found that there's only 0.3% of transit riders are currently accessing transit by bike. However, a third of the region's population lives within a bike ride of a transit stop. And for people who work near a transit stop, that figure is even larger at about 62%. So there's this huge opportunity to capture those trips and transition them to bikes instead of driving or other vehicle-oriented modes, and capture them by bike. So what are the barriers? Why aren't people doing this? Well, there's linking bike and transit trips compounds all of the traditional reasons that people don't choose to bike, these physical barriers, volume, speeds, topography. But there's also these psychological barriers that come with chaining transit trips with bike trips. Mode switch logistics, just like it would add logistics to your trip to change between a train and a bus. And travel time budgets. People might not be as willing to carve out the portion of their day for this trip that might take them, 20 to 50% longer. So Atlanta, at both the local and regional levels, has been planning their future bike environment to minimize these barriers. Throughout this presentation, I'll share some of the proposed solutions from both the local plan and the regional plan done recently, taking lessons from the Dutch lessons. And these plans are organized both around these three scales. I find it helpful to think about the bike transit connection. Any barrier can happen at these three scales: the network scale, the corridor scale, and then the station or stop scale. At the network scale, the City of Atlanta used 6 transit stations as the basis for their study area for their most recent bike plan, Cycle Atlanta 2.0. This creates sort of a mini network around each station and builds in that bike transit connection to the overall plan. One of the most significant barriers in Atlanta that is not necessarily similar to the Dutch context is that a lot of our transit service, especially for the suburban areas, takes the form of commuter bus, and their station is a park and ride lot, often located along a highway or a freeway, a place that's not really conducive to bike activity, either along it or across it. So to overcome that, they recommend increasing the density of the overall bike network, making sure that no matter what street you enter from, you're able to access that park and ride instead of only accessing it from the arterial or the highway entrance. Another really common constraint that we see in the suburban context is that the low stress streets do not connect. So in order to access the station, you might have to go 50% out of your way just to come back along the major arterials or the other major streets that connect to the station. So the solution here is to build some neighborhood access ways, short stretches of trail that connect the cul-de-sac development that's so common down here in the Southeast. Trails and multi-use paths are very favorable in Atlanta right now. There's a lot of support for them from all different angles, but oftentimes the constraint with connecting these facilities to transit is that they follow greenway corridors or utility corridors, other places that don't have direct connections to destinations. So an important strategy is to always have a on-street spur trail, if possible, to connect to the station. And this slide here shows an example of that treatment from Utrecht, where the street transitions directly into a multi-use path that connects through the park. So switching down one step from network to corridor scale, the major challenge that we need to overcome in Atlanta along the corridors is this bus bike leapfrogging issue. If you bike frequently along a bus corridor, you've probably noticed the phenomenon of being stuck behind a bus, needing to merge into traffic, and then the bus passing you again. And it's uncomfortable in addition to unsafe, needing to merge in and out of traffic every time the bus is stopped in front of you. This is the graphic that Chris and Melissa shared as well, showing this bus boarding island design concept where you can have a bike lane separated from the bus island and the bus does not inhibit movement of the bike traffic. This is an example from the Dutch context of that facility in action. Another way to incorporate this bus boarding island feature is with two-way bike lanes. Atlanta has a lot of existing side paths along their suburban arterials. This is sort of our solution for upgrading that to a more dedicated facility with a two-way bike lane and a separate sidewalk. So you minimize the conflict between pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as between the bus and the bikes. Another example of this facility in action from the Netherlands, showing the two-way bike lane separated from the bus boarding area and then a dedicated bus loading zone. Another common constraint that we have in the Atlanta region is just that there is limited opportunity for the bikeway on the major street. So a lot of congestion in Atlanta, not a lot of political support for reducing roadway capacity and adding the type of bike facility that's required for a street like that. So the suggestion here is to do a parallel route and make sure that you have these low speed facilities similar to the Wooner style living street facility that's been developed in the Netherlands dating back to the 70s. As evidenced here, you see the chicanes sort of narrowing down the street and the bikes are still able to pass in their normal path. This shared street facility is also really important to bring to our historic town centers in Atlanta, many of which do not have capacity to widen the roadway. A lot of them have existing bus service. So this concept of the commercial greenway kind of retrofits the shared street, residential street for a commercial zone with pavers and bollards and on-street parking to calm traffic. Again, this is an example from the Netherlands showing that facility, the inspiration behind that solution. And finally, the station scale. There is a lot of questions that need to be addressed when thinking about how bikes access the transit station. Chris and Melissa showed some excellent examples of bike parking in Utrecht, and you have to get people to that. You have to make sure they know where to go. So when you're designing a station or retrofitting a station, this one is a subway station in Atlanta, ask yourself, where are the bike routes that pass by the station? Where are the access points that people can enter in? What is the path that bicyclists are most likely to take? Because you can prescribe a path, but bicyclists are always going to take the shortest path. So making sure that you accommodate for that variability in what you plan for. And then making sure that the fare gates, the elevators, these facilities are easy to find for people to bring on the train, which is allowed in Atlanta, unlike some other major cities. This is an example from Utrecht Central Station, and I'm really excited that Chris and Melissa showed the example of the bike parking because this is the entrance into that bike parking. You'll notice there's a two-way bike lane that leads right up into the station, and then at the bottom right of the photo, you can see these, shallow stairs that lead down into the parking that have bicycle wheel channels as well. So it's really convenient to hop off the bike lane, walk your bike to these stairs, and then roll it down into the parking area. We know we also need short-term parking at transit stations because it's not always feasible for people to be able to bring their bike onto the bus or onto the train. So offering short-term parking that's as close to the boarding area as possible is really important. And then as you go further out into the more suburban areas, the more remote areas where people might not want to just leave their bike on the staple rack all day, offering options that give people more security about leaving their bikes. You can do a sort of modular bike secure parking area. This is kind of this cage style where you could use a fob that was associated with your transit pass to get in and out throughout the day. Another model is to integrate it into development itself, into either the station or adjacent TOD development. This example is from the Netherlands, showing that you can hand your bike right to a staff person in this parking area who can also do tune-ups throughout the day and fix whatever you might have gone wrong with your bike on the way to the transit station. And then finally, for events, doing pop-up valet. We have the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition in Atlanta is great about doing this. They, for any sporting events or other large events where they expect a lot of bicycle traffic, tend to do these pop-up bike valets, making them more formalized. And this is another example from the Netherlands. This was just a Saturday afternoon, knowing that there was going to be a lot of activity to this downtown commercial center. So starting a pop-up bike parking area for that. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you all so much.
All right, thanks, Kat. Great. And now I'm gonna share, let's see, Chris and Melissa, can I have you put up that last slide, and I'm gonna make you the presenter just as something to have the backdrop. And then, oh, and then it pops away. And then Michelle, I will hand it over to you to give some remarks.
Great, thank you. So my name is Michelle Poyourow, and I am a transit planner with a small firm called Jarrett, Walker and Associates. We are exclusively transit planners. We work around the US and Canada, a little bit in Australia and New Zealand, and also in European cities. And my role on this panel is not to make a presentation, but to be available during the Q&A for any questions that are particularly about transit, the planning and design of rail lines, the planning and design of bus networks, and the way that bicycles can expand their reach. So I really am glad that Chris and Melissa and Kat talked about the limits of the limited growth that is possible with bikes on board. I live and work in Portland, Oregon, which was one of the early adopters of great bike racks on buses and bike racks on trains, and it's a wonderful amenity that just does not scale. So once you reach that limit, you have to make a really odd argument that 4 customers with bikes are more important than the 10 customers without bikes that could stand in that space instead. And that's an argument that works in a few places, but generally can't be made. And so you have to look at ways to get more people on your transit system with the aid of bikes. And the 3 of them have shown us some wonderful examples. So I also appreciate Chris and Melissa's geometric explanation of why bikes are powerful here. Whatever the density of your station area or the area around your transit stop, whatever the number of people who are within a reasonable walk of that stop, that number can be much higher if those people can move faster by being on bicycles. So there's a very simple geometric explanation for why bicycles can increase transit ridership. There are 2, however, big challenges that I see for American cities, and ways that American cities are very different from Dutch cities. Atlanta typifies them perfectly, and so I think Kat's experience working in Atlanta is probably really informative for these challenges. One of them is that so much of American cities are actually suburbs, and they have 2 characteristics. They are low density, which means not very many people or activities per square mile, or square kilometer, and they are single use, which means almost all residential or almost all commercial or employment. And those two factors make all kinds of non-driving modes difficult. So single useness makes it very difficult to provide any service that depends on a shared fleet. And what I mean by a shared fleet is a bunch of vehicles or objects that individual people don't own, but that they use to get to a station or to a city center. So shared bicycles, shared scooters, shared cars like Uber and Lyft, and shared buses like transit services. When you have a single-use environment, the travel pattern tends to be one way. So it's towards the station in the morning or towards the business district in the morning. And anytime you have a shared fleet, that means your fleet can basically make one trip, and then it has to be deadheaded back. And that deadheading costs something. It costs something whether it's an Uber or Lyft driver deadheading back, whether it's a shared bike that has to be put on a truck and driven back, or a scooter, or a bus that has to be driven back empty to the suburb to go pick up more people. So single-use land use planning has this cost that is the reason that we see park and rides, so that people can bring their own car and have it sit empty all day, and no one has to drive it back to the suburb to go pick up more people. And that is a particular challenge for wonderful systems like bike share systems, because that deadheading is a real cost. And what we see in European cities is a more mix of use, which means that you could have a shared fleet that takes people to a station, and some number of those vehicles are actually brought back in the other direction, because there are enough people going the other way that the repositioning happens for free. The other challenge I see in American cities is low density. And the reason I see this being really challenging, especially for designing comfortable, safe, and attractive bikeways to stations, is that street design arises from density and land use planning. Those two are really related, strongly related, not just through tradition and not just through culture, but through geometry. When we have a low density place, that means that people and things are far apart. And that means that to get between them, they need and want to go fast. And to go fast, we build higher speed roadways. It also means that to go between them, people need to use cars more of the time, which means we build bigger roadways. And so in lower density places, we tend to have roadways that are less hospitable to walking and biking. That's not the rule, but it's certainly the general case. So in lower density places, it's then harder to make that bike trip to the station appealing. And I think Kat has described some really smart strategies for starting to repair that in a suburban environment. But so these are two particular American challenges: the single-useness of suburbs and the low densities of suburbs. And one of the places I think you can look to see some of the highest ridership transit in our country, and one of the places where bikes could be such a great tool, but for street design, is these sort of state highway commercial strips that so many American cities have. I think that Charles Marone calls them stroads. They are high-speed, wide arterials, lots of driveways, low-rent commercial, big parking lots. They're not very attractive, not very charming. But if you go look at the bus routes on those roads, they are often full all day long, not just at rush hour, and in both directions. And so that's a great example of a place where bikes could be a great tool, but for the way the street operates. And bike share could be a great tool because of the two-wayness, but the street is so inhospitable. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir. I'm sure everyone on this webinar has experience working on these exact same challenges. But when I think about how can we do this Dutch model in the US, I think about the challenge of low density, which gives us these difficult streets, and single-useness, which gives us these expensive fleet repositioning problems. So thank you for allowing me to join. I'm happy to be a resource during the Q&A on anything related to transit design or bike and transit design.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. All right. Well, we've got great questions coming in. I'm going to hand it over to Corinne, who's going to ask some of these and perhaps some of her own. So here you go, Corinne.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Jen, and thanks to Melissa, Chris, Kat, and Michelle for some really great presentations and really rich information to kick us off. We've got a lot of questions coming in the chat box, and if you have a question to add, I would encourage you to type that in, and I'll be facilitating conversation for this portion of the webinar. So to kick us off, I think, something that I hear fairly commonly, Chris and Melissa, when cities in the US are looking to the Netherlands is, well, we're not the Netherlands. Where do we start? And it reminds me of a very common saying, the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, and the second best time is today. But I think it can be a very daunting prospect to a lot of US cities, which are faced with what Michelle so aptly described as very single-use land use patterns and really wide, fast-moving streets and a lot of car-oriented transportation policies. So a question for all three of you, just to kick us off, is what advice would you have to a city that really, is facing a lot of those challenges and is interested in building these connections, this virtuous cycle of demand between bikes and transit, but doesn't know where to begin?
Well, I think where we would start, and what we often emphasize, and we emphasize in the book throughout our presentations and conversations we have, is that we hear that statement that the Netherlands is so far ahead and we can never be them, and we're in a different context all the time. And it's just a reminder, if we look back into the history, yes, they're probably a couple generations ahead of us, maybe 50 years or so, but they, even in the 60s and 70s, looked at ways to reorient themselves, and we're still seeing those changes today. So that Utrecht station that we use as the example is only just now being completed, and the network to connect to it is also still a work in progress. So the lessons are there, and we can learn from them and adapt them. Everything that we researched in the book is all about context. So finding a way to take these lessons and apply them in a context for your city. And I think that what Kat and Alta have been doing in Atlanta is the perfect example of taking that idea and creating it in a context that makes sense for the lived environment there. And the one thing that I think we don't really touch on, and it doesn't really solve the hostile road conditions per se, but we're really seeing a rise in e-bikes in every city that we visit, every city we talk about. And so that helps when we're talking about these spread out suburbs and trying to connect with transit in terms of providing another solution to that mobility challenge.
Really also break down a lot of the physical and mental barriers around cycling. So my city's hilly, my city's sweaty, my city's XYZ. I think e-bikes go a long way to address a lot of those concerns and to help welcome new people into cycling.
I can offer a where to start suggestion. Find out who owns the land right adjacent to your transit stops, especially if we're talking about any kind of rail station. Many transit agencies actually own a significant amount of land right around the transit stop. If we're looking at a photo of a Dutch train station here with copious bike parking, but I think if we just panned the camera right a little bit, what we would see is probably 3 or 4 story buildings right across the street where lots and lots of people live or work, and are therefore walking distance from service and are cycling distance from everything else in that neighborhood. Transit agencies traditionally in this country, meaning in the last 40 years, have built big asphalt parking lots right next to transit stations, which fill with cars once a day, and each of those cars represents 1 or maybe 1.5 transit riders who get on the train. Most places have found that if you, instead of parking lots, have buildings, that will actually generate many more transit riders. Plus, it can help a community address a lot of their other goals related to reducing car use. So I would start in your community by finding out who owns the land near your transit stops. And if it's currently used for parking cars, start a conversation about whether that's really the best use, both for the transit ridership and for the bikeability and for the street design and all the other goals for that community. Transit agencies are understandably afraid of converting free park and rides into anything else because there's this constituency of vocal, empowered people who think that that parking belongs to them and will maybe stop riding transit if it goes away. So that's a really politically hard transition to make. But the land, if it's owned by the transit agency, is a public asset, and that should be a conversation about what makes the greatest public good.
I would also add that education and encouragement are hugely important with this transition. You know, we're not the Netherlands in terms of physical context, and we're also not the Netherlands in terms of psychological behavior. And I think that in order to achieve this shift, you need the infrastructure, but you also need transportation demand management programming and other encouragement programs that help people realize that this is an option, even if they already know about the infrastructure and that's not helping them.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you know, I hear folks say often that the Netherlands didn't look like our modern vision of the Netherlands, you know, 40 years ago. So the time to start is really now to make this progress. We have a question in the box here about a challenge that Michelle, you actually touched on in your remarks, the fact that it's not always the city who owns the street in question. And so some of the designs can be really challenging to make on state-owned corridors. And Kat, you may be seeing this in Atlanta as well. So I'm curious, what are some examples that any of you have seen of how state departments of transportation have contributed to these kinds of network connections between bikes and transit?
Well, this isn't in a North American context, but we can, having just returned from Australia, we saw some really great stuff in Perth in Western Australia. In the state government has built a lot of multi-use paths, 4.5 meter wide, beautiful red asphalt paths that are straight out of the Netherlands on a lot of their rail corridors, their state highways, and their waterways. That connect a lot of the transit stations and then ultimately to secure bike parking at each train station. So we were pleasantly surprised, having gone to Australia with relatively low expectations, that even in a fairly sparse and low density city such as Perth, they've connected some of those dots. Now the actual on-street infrastructure requires a lot of work, but that's the municipal government letting the residents down. In this case, it's really the state government that's taken leadership in building the infrastructure that connects to the train stations and those those bike parking facilities at the transit hubs.
Yeah, and this is part of their overall planning as well. So any new rail stations along the corridor, any new motorways that they're building, all must have some form of adjacent cycle track or multi-use path. So we saw even in a new construction of a stretch of highway, building safe ways to navigate around clover leaves and the like. So at least in that context of providing safe facilities to arrive at the transit station, and then their rail system, intercity rail, gets them in and out of the city center fairly seamlessly from, a very North American concept of these expanded suburbs that we're very much used to here in Canada and also in the US.
I live and do quite a bit of work in Oregon, and Oregon is blessed with a fairly progressive state DOT, Department of Transportation, at least when it comes to bicycle planning. And so there are some examples here, some nice examples. My observation is that at least here, our state Department of Transportation tends to look at more separation as the solution. So they're more interested in separated bikeways. Now, I mean, the standard design for any street that's being rebuilt is to have a shoulder or a bike lane. But rather, the cities, I notice, tend to emphasize slowing down the street, are less interested in using measures like level of service, looking at just car throughput, are more interested in looking at person throughput, the DOT tends to be more interested in investing in more expensive multi-use paths to get the bikes away from cars, and they're wonderful. I'm not complaining about them, but it's not a solution you can do everywhere. So if you want to look at a really nice but very expensive example, here in Portland, Oregon, our Green Line MAX train, MAX train, was built along with a shared use path, both in a freeway trench. So that means that there was enough space for all the modes to be separate. The shared use path for biking and walking is very safe from car traffic, pretty nice crossings of major streets, great connections to the rail lines. So a lot of really, really good things to learn from there. The one downside is that it's in a freeway trench. And as you know, as Kat described, with the Atlanta examples, when your transit stations are adjacent to something like a freeway or any kind of linear right-of-way like that, there's just less within walking distance or less within biking distance. So that project, I would say, is a mixed bag. You can look at a number of things that are really laudable and great designs to replicate, but it also has its challenges. But that is an example of a state DOT using its power as the owner of the freeway right-of-way, and its resources to do something that really does help a bike-to-transit connection.
Yeah, in Atlanta, we unfortunately do not have the same progressive view, I think, that Oregon DOT has taken about connecting transit in particular and bikes. Georgia is one of the states that contributes the least to its major metropolitan cities transit system. So they have, most of the state is rural and it's not really a high priority on their list. But I will say there's similar, attention toward multi-use paths versus on-street infrastructure. Definitely willing to talk about that. And, making the conversation about safety, I think, is always the most compelling reason to go with the state DOT, because that is definitely one of their priorities.
Great, thanks all. I'd like to return to this theme that Melissa and Chris brought up in their presentation about really the potential of geometry here, where the bike is a really useful tool for short trips, for nimble trips, and transit is a really powerful tool for moving vast numbers of people in less space. And that's really a key theme of, Michelle, of your work with Jarrett Walker and Associates, is the beneficial geometry of transit. We have a question from one of the folks in the audience about opportunities for cities, small and medium cities in the US that don't really have much rail or heavy transit, where transit is much more exclusively bus. And this person's actually in Georgia as well, Kat. So would love some thoughts from any of you on how to leverage that powerful virtuous cycle of bikes and transit and the geometry benefits of each when we're talking mostly about buses and bus-centered transit hubs.
Yeah, that's a great question, because the vast majority of transit available on this planet is buses, and the vast majority of the transit rides that people take on this planet are on buses. I've been thinking about why it is that people are less interested in riding a bike to a bus stop and locking up their bike and then waiting for the bus. And I think they are less interested in that. I am. When I think about that, that sounds less appealing than riding my bike to a transit station and locking my bike up and waiting for a train. A train station. And I think it is very little about the vehicle. I think it is not that one of them is on rubber tires and the other is on steel rails, and one of them has a diesel engine and the other one has electric. I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's about the reliability and the frequency of the service. And I think it's about the waiting environment. So a train and a train station typically offers a ride that's coming frequently. So if it's light rail, every maybe 15 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, or if it's a commuter rail, at least during rush hours, pretty good frequency. High speeds, so it's really worth it to make that extra segment in your trip because you get this payoff once you get on the transit vehicle. You are whisked very fast to your destination. So frequency, speed, reliability, it's probably going to show up when it's supposed to show up. So that's features of the service. That has nothing to do with whether it's a bus or a train, whether it's rubber tired or metal wheeled. It has to do with how much service is paid for, and that delivers the frequency. How protected is it from traffic and randomness, and that delivers the reliability. And how protected is it from congestion, and that delivers the speed. And you can do those things with buses and with trains alike. The other thing is the waiting environment. You get to a train station and there's probably someplace large and under cover from rain or from sun, or maybe out of the wind. There's probably nice places to sit. There might be vending machines. There might be a coffee shop. It's probably a nicer place to wait and to leave your bike than just the side of the road with bike parking. So what I would say is if you're in a community that doesn't have rail and you want to use this geometric power of the bike to expand that catchment area around your transit system, don't hold out for a rail line, because the railness isn't what makes this work. Look for your transit services that are or can be frequent, fast, and reliable, and focus on making the waiting environments in those places. And as Kat described, focus on making the bike network and the pedestrian network rich so that people can actually get there and understand that they can get there and know what to do once they get there. And I think you will have some success there. That said, many transit agencies aren't bothering yet to look at bus lines and try to make them faster, more reliable, and more frequent. They may not be focused on that. But if they are, I think that's something that you can also focus on, and you can start supporting in your work to grow the catchment area through the power of the bicycle.
I think there's a little bit to going back to what Michelle was saying earlier around that idea, and I think it's also building on what Michelle was saying around Michelle and Kat, sorry, around that idea of education. And I think there is that mental block that Michelle was just describing around bus stations and leaving your bike outside. We're starting to see some really great bus facilities here in Vancouver as they're upgrading areas of high use to make sure that those covered areas are there and incorporating them into bike storage where you can. But I think there will always be that little bit of a mental block in terms of why would I bike to the bus? And it comes back to that idea of geometry, when we're coming back to that idea of distance, because we can move faster to get to these stations. So, even if a bus only comes every 15 minutes, but it's the bus that will get you there in around the same amount of time as if you drove, walking there probably will take a little bit longer, but hop on a bike and suddenly that trip is quicker. So, getting into trip planning and thinking around how do we make this quick and convenient through education and marketing from the transit authorities, from local cities, and advocates of these, combining these modes, I think would be a way to get a little bit over that mental barrier of buses, because I think Chris and I both acknowledge that, a lot of Canadian cities, a lot of American cities, bus is the primary public transportation option, but it doesn't mean that we should overlook its potential in this combination.
Yeah, if you're in Georgia, it's a tall order to ask someone to bike to a park and ride station on the side of the highway and lock their bike and hop on the bus and then take the bus down to downtown Atlanta. It's so you have to make it a one high quality bike trip to encourage people to do that. And I think once you build the infrastructure that leads directly to that station, and then the bike parking at the station that makes riders feel comfortable leaving their bike there, as Melissa just mentioned, it takes the encouragement. So get people to try it once, give people incentives to get on transit for a week and maybe bike to the transit station, have people reach out and bike with other people to the transit station, and just get people to try it, and they might see that it's not quite as bad as it seems psychologically.
I'd like to add, it's not just hard to get people to bike to a transit station and then take the transit. It's also hard to get people to drive. Look at what we have to do to get people to drive to transit. We provide them with free parking at the station, which actually costs tens of thousands of dollars to build and operate every year. We charge them for parking at their destination end to discourage them from taking their car all the way. And we provide them with often really good and really expensive transit service to get from their car parking spot to their destination. And despite this, many park and rides don't fill up. So what most people do is they use one mode to get where they're going, and that's what they prefer. And breaking the journey and moving from one mode to another mode is a hurdle. And despite spending tons of money trying to get people to take a car trip that becomes a transit trip, not that many people do it. And most of the transit rides in this country, the vast majority, are people walking there because they're close enough. So this isn't a bike problem. This is a multimodal problem. And it's not like it's succeeding with cars and now we need to make it work for bikes. It's not succeeding for cars. And bikes, if we can make it work for bikes, it's so much cheaper and so much healthier and so much better for our cities than all of the attempts we've been making to get people to go from car to train or car to bus.
Yeah, I think to Melissa's earlier point about the trip planning too, it's been exciting to see some, trip planning apps like Citymapper and others starting to incorporate bike transit combinations to show possibilities for those trips that are too cumbersome by transit and too far for bike alone. So that's been an exciting trend, I think. We've got time probably for one more question, and we've got a few in here about the potential of bike sharing as a tool to sort of introduce people to this idea of biking to transit and to eliminate some of the challenges of personal bike parking. So I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on bike sharing or examples in cities where that's been a successful tool to complement transit, or any thoughts looking ahead to e-bikes and scooters and other shared personal mobility options.
So Atlanta has bike share stations at all of its MARTA transit stops right now. That was a big priority for their second phase of bike share launch, and their next phase is planned to include e-bikes as well to help overcome some of those other barriers. It's been very successful. I will also say that there's not a lot of data about this yet, but anecdotally, you do also see people now using the recently added scooters, the Bird and Lime scooters, to transit as well. So I think the more options that we can give people, and as the dockless technology becomes better too, the more flexible it becomes, the easier it will be to chain all of those trips together.
And I think part of that has to be making the payment system as seamless as possible. Right now, I think there's a big barrier in terms of paying for multiple bike or scooter sharing services in addition to your transit pass. And there has actually been some movement in terms of departments of transportation. I think LA is looking at making, including a free bike share trip as a transfer on when you pay for your transit fare. In the Netherlands, they have one chip card, OB chip card, that pays for their national train system, their local buses and trams, and the bike share. So I think trying to combine all these payment options into one single card or single app would reduce a lot of headaches and make people more prone to take these or make these choices if we just make it a little bit easier for them.
And that comes down to the idea of equity as well. When we're talking about more dispersed communities, and a lot of, to be honest, a lot of people using public transportation outside of major city centers usually have some economic barrier to buying a car in the first place. So if you're linking it to the transit pass or transit ticket, then there's the less reliance on having to have a credit card to have a bike share membership or a scooter membership, less reliance on having the most updated smartphone to use all of these systems. It really helps to eliminate some of those barriers when we're talking about social equity and reaching not just those with the means to integrate these systems together.
Yeah, I agree that the ease of payment and ease of discovery also is really key. I'm a huge fan of bike share, and I think it was an interesting story that Chris and Melissa that you tell in the book about how some of the bike sharing you see in the Netherlands is actually planned and provided by the transit provider, and there's good reason for that. Not that I'm trying to give transit agencies more to do, but I think there are some benefits to them covering that last mile part of the system. But again, I want to come back to this caution about shared fleets. If you imagine we're in a single-use suburban area, say in Atlanta, and we want to get people to the station, and so we put out 100 shared bikes. If it's a residential area, then what happens is 100 people ride those bikes down to the station, and then that's it. Maybe 3 people ride them back in the morning peak for some reason. You have to reposition those bikes for them to move more than one person per day. So that's the problem with one-wayness in any shared fleet system. And you will see that with scooters. You see that with car to go. If you look at where the cars to go are in the morning and in the midday and in the evening, you get that one-wayness. And again, with public transit. So bike share is awesome. I think it's still worth it, even though it has the one-wayness problem, but that's something that does have to be dealt with. I also think it's particularly useful when we have these very large employment campuses that decide to locate 1 mile from the transit stop instead of at the transit stop. This is something that they can make their problem. They chose that location, and so something they can do is provide a bike share system and the staff to rebalance the bikes a couple times a day to help their employees make that last mile trip to campus or to work. And so there's a nice example of that in Oregon, which is Nike on our west side light rail line. They funded a bike share system that could help their employees make that last mile.
Great. Thanks all. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's a lot of really good questions here, so thanks so much to everyone for typing those in. But I need to turn it back over to Jen now.
Right. Yep. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Karim, for moderating, and thank you to all of our panelists. Great conversation. We are going to be sending out the recording of this, so feel free to share it with everybody that you know, put it on social media. And please fill out the survey that will be popping up soon. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.